Cami. I'm going to make an executive decision. It's right at 3:05. I see we do have 20 folks here. I'm going to decide that that is critical mass, and we're going to get things rolling. I just would like to share with everyone that we are recording the meeting today so that we will have this recorded, that we can post it on the resource site. So if you have someone that wanted to come to the meeting today and was not able to get here, you can let them know that if they give us a couple of days, we'll have the recording available and they will be able to have a chance to hear what you're today. So let's see if I can get my computer to play nice with me here. So you are in the NCEES Understanding the Rubric session today. The NCEES team who helped to design this content are Cami Nairn, who you have heard already this afternoon, my colleague, Dr. Kimberly Simmons, and myself. I'm the business owner for the Educator Evaluation System. Great for her, but sad for us. Dr. Simmons actually retired at the end of July. So we are in the process. We have put out a posting to try to fill that position. She leaves some really big shoes to fill, but I did want to acknowledge her contribution to the session today because she did help to design the content that we'll be going through today. So I will be your host for today, and I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about who I am and why you should care. So I am Robert Sachs, and I am the Educator Standards and Evaluation Director for the Department of Public Instruction. That means it's my job to make sure that we are working hard to comply with all of the statutes and the policies related to evaluation. And I work in partnership with the NCEES consultant, who was Dr. Simmons and will at some point in the near future be someone else, to make sure that those policies are communicated. And one of our very important partners is Cami Nairn, who provides the direct technical expertise for the online tool. So while Cami works in a different division than the NCEES consultant and myself, we make up a small cross-divisional team to make sure that you receive the kind of support that you need to accomplish the things that you're doing in your work, whether you're a principal, a teacher, or a human resources professional who supports principals and teachers. I have been doing this work around the evaluation system since 2011, when I started at the Department of Public Instruction, and that was the third year that this rubric was in implementation in North Carolina. It was the first full year of implementation for the whole state. It was implemented in a 3-year pilot. A third of the state came on board. The next year, the next third came on board. And in the 2010-11 school year, the final third came on board. So we've been using this teacher rubric for 10 years now for the entire state of North Carolina. And I was a part of a team that Dr. Kimberly Simmons and I were on at the very beginning, who were charged with communicating the expectations of this rubric out to teachers and principals throughout the state. And so as a part of that work, we used to be involved with sessions called principal ready sessions, where we brought principals together in each of the regions to talk about the rubric and the expectations, and they helped to plan and design some tools and resources, many of which are now available on the resources site. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the outcome of really all of that 10 years worth of work to help provide information, to help develop a greater understanding of the teacher rubric and the expectations of the teacher rubric. In layman's terms, what we'll be talking about today is, so what does the NCEES rubric really say? And while my actual title is Director of Educator Standards and Evaluation, it might be more appropriate to call me the self-proclaimed NCEES nerd, because after spending 10 years supporting teachers and principals in using this tool, I have developed a great deal of knowledge and recognition across and within each of the standards that I hope I can put some of that into service when I share with you the things we'll be talking about today in this webinar on understanding the teacher rubric. Now, because this is a WebEx meeting, I've already mentioned that this is being recorded, so we will have it posted on the resource site in a day or two so that others can avail themselves to this information. We do ask that if you have a question, that you please put that question into the chat feature within the WebEx meeting. If you put something in chat, everyone will be able to see it. If you enter something as a question only Cami or I will be able to see those things, and Cami will see it. I actually won't, because none of those windows are popping up on my screen right now as I'm sharing the PowerPoint. But you can toggle your microphone on and off. You can also toggle your camera on and off. If you want to have your camera on, please feel free. Some folks who are in places where the internet is not very robust find that if they turn off their camera, it saves some bandwidth, and they have a little better connection to the information that's being shared. As we are doing our work together today, we just ask that you think about and minimize the outside distractions, participate to the degree that you are able. If you're having technical difficulties, if you can reach out either via the chat or raise your hand, we'll work on trying to provide some support to you to make sure that you have the support you need to proceed and continue to be engaged or involved. Use the chat or the Q&A on your dashboard, remembering that chat everyone will see. Q&A will be more of a private message that Cami will be able to see, but no one else will. And then mute your microphone, just so that if you do have to do something else, then other folks aren't listening to those sounds behind you. And again, video is not needed. If you want to keep your camera on, feel free, but you may find that your bandwidth is a little stronger if you eliminate the need for your computer to keep up with that. After this session is over, if you participated, you will get a follow-up email in the next day or so. The purpose of that follow-up email is to help you get a certificate to show that you participated in this webinar today. In order to get that certificate, you need to complete a feedback survey. We need to get your feedback, and that has a trigger in it to help you get the certificate. It also, that information in that link will help you have information about how to get to the recording of the webinar. So again, if you had friends that wanted to participate, that want to know how to see that, as well as links to resources that we discussed during the webinar today. There are a couple of things that I'm hoping we can get pasted in the chat bar for you today related to the slides, but if for some reason we're not able to, they'll definitely be in the follow-up email that we will send to you. And also, if we get any questions during the webinar that we're not able to answer, we'll provide information about those questions in that email communication as well. So as we're working together today for the time, this is a rather long session. This session is about twice as long as the typical webinar sessions are, and it's just because of the volume of information that we want to try to provide and share with you. But we do have some overarching goals and that we hope to get through over the hour and 45 minutes that we have left to do this work today. And so the first one is really to talk about the purpose of the educator evaluation system. It's designed to do several things, not just make judgments and provide a rating or a grade for teachers. Also to explore the language used to describe the expectations for a teacher's professional practice and instructional practice. We have a rubric that actually measures two different kinds of practice. So after today, you should have a stronger awareness of where those two kinds of practices are within the elements in the rubric itself. And then finally, to consider ways that the structure of the rubric can help support teacher growth and improvement. So how might you use the rubric, the language inside, and the way that it's configured to help a teacher reflect on their practice and improve their practice? So as we do this work today, we could work through this as water skiing, or we could deep dive into some concepts. Again, we only have about 2 hours to go through this. So we're going to be water skiing through most of it, skimming across the top. And in a few little spots, we'll do a deep dive into a couple of the pieces of content that we'll be working with today. So our North Carolina Educator Evaluation System, we use an acronym, and we typically refer to that as NCEES. NCEES stands for North Carolina Educator Evaluation System. It also stands for the North Carolina Educator Effectiveness System. In home base, the NCEES system is the North Carolina Educator Effectiveness System because it also includes the professional development side of the home-based tools that are inside of NCEES. But our evaluation system has standards and the process. And what you see here on the screen is a document that I refer to as the red card. And the red card is it's a small, concise document that identifies the standards and the elements and the expectations. It's the kind of thing that if you went to a national workshop for what teaching was like in North Carolina, they might hand this handout to you. It has about 5 or 6 pages. But what educators in North Carolina are more familiar with is the Teacher Evaluation Process Manual, because it includes the standards, the elements, but also the rubric with all of the requisite descriptors beneath them, and the various portions of the process, the forms that need to be completed, and the process requirements for both observing practice in classrooms as well as completing the evaluation in the summary rating form at the end. So North Carolina's educator evaluation process, so not the rubric, not just the rubric itself, but the process, the thing that you do from the very beginning of school all the way through to the end when you complete the summary evaluation form and receive a rating for all of the work that the teacher has done throughout the year. It's intended to accomplish a variety of things. The idea is that the process helps to serve as a measurement of individual performance for teachers. It also is intended to serve as a guide so that teachers can reflect on and improve their practice and their effectiveness throughout the year. It's designed to serve as the basis for instructional improvement. One of the ways that it does that is the very first thing that a teacher does is a self-assessment every year in the system. It's also intended to help focus on goals and objectives of the school and the district, and using them to help support, monitor, and evaluate teachers. So finding that alignment between the expectations of the teachers and the priorities of the district and the school itself. The process is also intended to guide professional development and help support teachers in their professional learning. That's why the professional development plan, the PDP, is a key feature of the teacher evaluation process that you are involved with each year in the online tool. It's also intended to serve as a tool to develop, to coach, and to mentor teachers, and mentoring programs and coaching resources that are provided for the educators who are in those teacher leadership roles are designed to provide leadership to help teachers improve their practice in the North Carolina professional teaching standards. The standards also are intended to help support and enhance the implementation of the curriculum. So the idea that if teachers are doing the things that the North Carolina professional teaching standards expect, that it's also going to advance students' understanding in math, science, social studies, English language arts. And then finally, something that we don't think about as often in the practitioner or the working space of our public schools is that our educator evaluation process and the standards has to inform our higher education institutions, the colleges and universities that prepare teachers so that they can develop the content and the requirements for their teacher training programs. And within that, when these standards were first articulated and built out in 2007 and 2008, there was a recognition that the world in which students live was moving and changing at a very rapid pace, and the demands and expectations of our students moving into this 21st century that we are in now required some different ways of approaching teaching and approaching instruction. So these standards and the structure of the teacher evaluation process was intended to address this by making sure that it offered some clarity on what teachers need to know and do to help support students in moving forward in the ever-changing world that is our 21st century that we're in now. So the idea is that leadership among the staff with the administration is shared. So teachers and principals and assistant principals are working together to provide the contributions necessary to make the school the best place that it can possibly be. Also, that teachers make the content that they teach engaging, relevant, and meaningful so that it's well connected to the students' lives and they understand why they're learning the things that they're learning. It's really important to acknowledge that it's not enough to just cover the material, but you have to work with students to help solve problems and uncover solutions, so that by doing this work, making sure that we include critical thinking, problem solving, information, communication, and technology and literacy across the grade span to support student understanding in integrated ways. Also important in this design of these new standards 10 years ago was that making sure that the standards could help support teachers in facilitating instruction and helping students develop those 21st century skills so that they not only have the information and the knowledge, but they know how to learn, how to innovate, how to collaborate, and communicate their ideas to others. This brought about things like 21st century content, global awareness, civic literacy, financial literacy, all of these other ways of thinking and connections across disciplinary content and how to connect those with each of the core content areas. Making sure that subjects and projects are integrated within and across disciplines, supporting teachers in being reflective about their practice, and making sure that the assessments of student understanding are authentic and structured, and that they help students demonstrate what they've mastered and what they understand. And then finally, that teachers are seen by their students as modeling and valuing lifelong learning so that they can encourage students to think about how they can learn and grow by modeling as teachers that they themselves are learning and growing in the work that they do each day with their students. The standards are designed to support two distinct processes. And very often when we talk about the evaluation standards, we do just that. We talk about the evaluation standards. We actually only talk about one of those processes, but evaluation is a single component of what these standards are actually designed to do. Evaluation is the thing that happens at the end when the teacher is rated. It's the systematic judgment of evidences by a knowledgeable other for the summative purpose of assigning a rating of quality. But supervision is the intentional interaction with knowledgeable others for the formative purpose of improving practice. We used to say things 10 years ago like the educator evaluation system is all about growth. Well, when we would say things like that, what we were really saying was the evaluation process, the thing you engage in from the beginning of the year to the end of the year that includes classroom visits, observations, and a robust professional development plan, has built within it intentional interaction between the teacher and their evaluator, and for new teachers, their mentors, as well as peers, to help support their own reflection and their formative process of improving their practice over time. We were talking about supervision. We simply didn't use that word. Now, as we think about that, how to use this process for evaluation and supervision, teacher evaluation is an element of a really complex system that's designed to support improving educator effectiveness. And if you think about teaching as what occurs in the oval that you see in the center of the screen, teaching, the everyday work of teachers, is really a continuous improvement endeavor. As teachers come to their classroom each day or with each lesson with a particular set of instructional inputs, their lesson plan, the things they intend to teach and the way they've designed to provide that instruction. They provide the instruction to students during the lesson itself. And then as a result of that instruction, certain things occur. The kids learn, they take a quiz, they take an assessment, they produce some student artifact or resource, and based on the outcomes from that instruction, the teacher makes decisions about what it is the next thing that students need to learn. So there's a cyclical continuous improvement process here as the teacher is engaged in those instructional inputs, the instruction, and then the outcomes inform the next set of inputs. When these standards were designed, there was a belief that these things did not happen in isolation with a teacher doing this work all by themselves. But in fact, the teacher was a part of a professional learning community where they were working with other teachers. Very often, this is other teachers like them. So in the high school, this is science teachers with science teachers, social studies teachers with social studies teachers. At the elementary level, we're talking about grade level teams, the kindergarten team, the third grade team, the fifth grade team. And the idea is that those professional learning communities are working together to coach one another and collaborate, but then also engage in action research. And action research is really just a fancy way of saying the teacher tries something, they look to see whether it worked, and based on whether it worked or not, they make a decision about what to do next. So our standards assume that teachers are engaged in this work, collaborating with others in a professional learning community. So as we think about how a principal or an assistant principal can provide support to help the teacher do that work in that continuous improvement space over time, there need to be ways for the supporter of that teacher's work, the principal or the assistant principal, to have a sense of what's happening inside that space. There also needs to be a way for the teacher to be reflective of and to think about what's happening inside that space. So every year at the beginning of the year, we ask the teacher to engage in a self-assessment, to use the rubric to think about what it is that they do well and where they'd like to improve. From that self-assessment, we ask the teacher to design and implement some professional development goals in their PDP. And throughout the year, we invite the principal or the assistant principal to conduct classroom observations, to go visit those instructional spaces, and from those visits, provide formative feedback to the teacher. And those are typically accomplished through the post-conferences that happen after those classroom observations. Within those continuous improvement instructional spaces, there are two kinds of practice happening: professional practice and instructional practice. And we'll hold on to those ideas of professional practice and instructional practice for just a few minutes. So as we think about specifically those things that we want to look at for the teacher's self-assessment as well as the classroom observation, the tools we use to accomplish that are the tools that are in the evaluation process. The teacher evaluation rubric itself is the structure that we ask teachers to use for the self-assessment. It's also the same structure that the observer is using to provide that classroom feedback. And within those teacher standards, they are organized to measure both professional practice as well as instructional practice. So the tool for observing and assessing those standards is the NCEES rubric. And so thinking about that NCEES rubric, the NCEES rubric assesses two different kinds of practice. We're going to come back to that in a little more depth in just a few minutes, but those two kinds of practice are professional practice and instructional practice. And so the professional practice standards are standards 1 and 5, and the instructional practice standards are standards 2, 3, and 4. And you might think of standard 2, 3, and 4 as classroom practice, or classroom practices that are instructional practices. There are other ways to get information about instructional practices. We don't use these currently in North Carolina, but at one time we did have student surveys. Student surveys are another example of instructional practices that can be collected through the lens of the learner themselves. And then finally, over to the right, you see item labeled number 4 is student growth. We have collected in the past student growth outcomes from teachers using EVOS. And for the period of time that we had it, we had analysis of student work for your art teachers, your music teachers, and your other specialist teachers. The ASW process has been eliminated, but it is a tool we have used in the past to measure student growth. So as you think about these items, professional practice, which I've labeled item number 1, instructional practice, which is labeled item number 2 for classroom practice, item number 3 for student surveys, and then student growth, item number 4. I have organized these in this way to talk a little bit about when data is available from each of those types of practice. So the process of teacher evaluation is done in a very linear way, in the way that we use the tool. You log in, you do your self-assessment, you do all of the work throughout the year, and at the end of the year, you get your summary rating form. And it feels like at the beginning of each new year, you start a new process. But it's actually designed to be a cycle or to move around in a circle. And so as we think about the work that and the information that's available, at the end of the year, we have information about your professional practice, item number 1, your instructional or your classroom practice, item number 2, because at the end of the year, you have already received your ratings on the teacher evaluation process. If you had student surveys, you might have those results as well. So at the beginning of the year, when you get your school year started and you're developing your PDP can be built out using your self-assessment at the beginning of the year, but you also can look backwards to the previous year to see where you had strengths and where there were areas for growth in your professional and instructional practices to inform your initial PDP goals. Now, many people ask, what do I do with student growth? I don't get the EVOS growth until September or October at the earliest. Well, if you think about the PDP, September and October is too late to establish any beginning of the year PDP goals. However, we do have the mid-year check process designed in the PDP process. If you receive your EVOS information and you find from what you see about students, let's say you put in your PDP that you were going to engage in a whole bunch of literacy workshops because you wanted to make sure you were really strengthening your literacy instructional skills, but you discover based on your EVOS data that in that area, your students were doing extremely well. Well, you might want to reorganize or reorient your mid-year PDP. You may want to make some adjustments. Maybe there are other workshops you want to put in that PDP instead of some of those literacy workshops because you've discovered that you were so successful with those students last year. So EVOS outcomes are a professional development driver. And the idea is that that PDP should help to support the work that you're doing inside of your instructional space in the classroom. So there's intended to be a relationship of the evaluation process to the work that you're doing in the classroom. And the idea is instead of being linear and starting at the beginning of the school and ending at the end of the school year, the idea is it should be a cycle, should move in a circle. And this is what that circle looks like. These are the components of the annual evaluation process for teachers. You'll see in the center, there's a circle that identifies steps. Step 1 is training and orientation. Step 2 is the self-assessment and the goal setting and the pre-conference for the first observation. Step 3 is beginning the observation cycles that will take place to do the visits that occur throughout the year. And then step 4 is the summary evaluation and then goal setting for the following year, which should feed to step 1. This was designed to be a cycle that is continuous and theoretically connects each subsequent year to the following year as you move forward. And so these components are training. For anybody that's brand new to the state, they need to get trained. Once you've been trained every year annually, you should receive an orientation. At the beginning of the year, teachers should conduct a self-assessment and fill out the rubric based on what they believe their strengths and areas for growth are. There's the pre-observation conference to prepare for the first formal observation. And then the first formal observation kicks off the observation cycle. Depending on how long the teacher's been doing this teacher thing, a teacher might be on a comprehensive observation cycle. A comprehensive is a cycle that looks at the most standards and has the most people looking. So a comprehensive cycle includes the teacher working with their mentor, being observed by the principal or their designee, and also being observed by a peer. The standard cycle looks at all of the standards and the teacher partners with the principal or the principal's designee. And the abbreviated cycle is for those teachers who have been doing this teaching thing for 4 or more years. And the abbreviated cycle requires 2 classroom visits each year. So as a part of component 5, those observations are conducted based on the kind or the plan type that teachers need. At the conclusion of all formal observations, there's a post-observation conference to talk about the processes and the things that were observed. At the end of the year, all of the data is collected to conduct a summary evaluation and provide the scores for the teacher on the rubric. And from that information, priorities for the following year's PDP are established. So as we think about all of the kinds of things that a teacher might do throughout the year, at the beginning of a teacher's career while they're still going to college, that teacher would be an aspiring teacher, which would be the extreme left-hand column of the graphic that you see here on the screen. Once the teacher has completed their program and gotten a job in North Carolina, for the first 3 years of their work, the teacher is a beginning teacher, and there are certain requirements that are in place for beginning teachers, and districts have to provide a certain level of support for beginning teachers. After a teacher's been at that for at least 3 years, they move to a continuing professional license, and at that point, they are an experienced teacher. An experienced teacher has completed all of those beginning teacher requirements, and an experienced teacher is then on a 5-year license cycle, and they renew their license every 5 years based on the professional development that they complete in each of those 5-year renewal cycles. And some teachers may choose to be experienced teachers for an entire 30-year career. Sometimes an experienced teacher is doing a really great job and their principal is able to talk them into allowing other teachers to come and watch what they're doing. And in those cases, that principal has convinced that teacher to become a model teacher, to allow other teachers to come and observe their practices and see what it is that they're doing and learn from them. If a model teacher says, hey, you know, I appreciate that someone else wants to come watch, but I'm also open to answer questions and talk to them about what they saw and help them think about their practice because it might also help me. Well, that model teacher then moves into a space to really become a teacher leader. And in North Carolina, we kind of have two models of teacher leaders. One model of teacher leader is a single classroom teacher leader, where they have primary responsibility for a single roster of students that are their students that they teach through their course or their homeroom. But there are also some teachers in North Carolina who support other teachers as a part of their work. And as a part of that work, they also take on the student outcomes of the students they reach through the other teachers with whom they're working. And those are multiple classroom teacher leaders. Then there are leaders of teachers. Teachers like curriculum coaches in your building, principals and assistant principals are leaders of teachers, and central office staff are also leaders of teachers. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, the rubric that we're talking about today, spans the greatest number of possible roles that a teacher might have over the course of their 30-year career. So it's really important for teachers and administrators to understand the structure and the design of the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards and the teacher rubric itself, because it does cover so many of the options for where a teacher might find themselves along a 30-year career span. So when our standards were designed, the intention of the designers of these standards was that they would be aspirational. So characterized by aspiring to a strong desire to do something. So the idea was, let's design a set of standards so that teachers in North Carolina, if they're good at these North Carolina standards, they represent some of the best teachers and the best teaching that's available in the United States. It's really important to build a set of standards that set a high bar. And so that was the intention of the designers of these standards, was to set a high bar for educators and educating in the state of North Carolina. But they also recognized that teaching included a variety of specific dimensions. And so from those dimensions, they articulated 5 specific areas or 5 distinct standards that teachers needed to have skills, knowledge, and abilities within. And you all know that standard 1 is teachers demonstrate leadership. Standard 2 is teachers establish a respectful environment for a diverse population of students. Standard 3 is that teachers know the content that they teach. Standard 4 is teachers facilitate learning for their students. And then standard 5 is teachers reflect on their practice. Now, if you think about these just in quick, easy terms, standard 1 is all about leadership. Standard 2 is all about equity. Standard 3 is all about content. Standard 4 is all about instruction. And standard 5 is all about reflection. So our 5 domains of the teacher standards are leadership, equity, content, instruction, and reflection. Now, as we think about each of those standards is broken down into smaller, more granular elements. And so standard 1 has 5 elements. Standard 1 is all about leadership. And if you look at the language, I've taken the time on the screen to actually color code and underline some words. And if you look at the language in standard 1, you find that one of the most prominent words is lead. Standard 1 is about leadership. And the first element says lead in. The second element says lead in. The third element says lead in. As we think about those 3 elements, though, there is a change in where that leadership is expected to occur. The first element in standard 1 is about leading in the classroom. The second element is about leading in the school. And the third element is about leading in the profession. If a teacher is going to be a leader in the classroom, in the school, and in the profession, one critical attribute that that teacher has to have is the ability to advocate for their school and advocate for their students. And as the teacher provides leadership in the classroom, the school, and the profession, and is working to be a strong advocate for the school and for students, it is essential that they demonstrate high ethical standards. And so these are the 5 elements of the leadership standard for the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards. Now, as we think about Standard 2, which is about establishing that respectful environment for a diverse population of students, this really is about equity and trying to support and meet the needs of the students who are in the teacher's classroom. Now, as we use that same color coding and underlining, what we find here is the expectation in Standard 2 is that the teacher is going to provide an environment that's positive and nurturing. They're going to embrace diversity, treat their students as individuals, adapt their teaching so that it benefits the students in their room, especially those with special needs, and then works collaboratively with the families of their students. So meeting the needs of students and addressing equity in the classroom, it's essential to provide that positive environment, embrace that diversity, treat those students as individuals, make those adaptations to meet the needs of the students, especially the special needs students, and then working collaboratively with the families. Standard 3 has 4 elements, and Standard 3 is about the content. And as we think about the expectations for content for teachers in Standard 3, the expectation is that they align their instruction with the standard course of study. They must know the content that they're supposed to be teaching their kids. But in addition to knowing the content, they need to recognize how that content interconnects with other content areas and other disciplines. And that content is really important. And part of the teacher's job is to help the students understand how important that content is by helping make the instruction relevant to the students so they will own and embrace the content as meaningful to them. Standard 4 is the largest of the standards because where the previous standards had 4 and 5 elements each, Standard 4 has 8 elements. And Standard 4 is all about instruction. It's about facilitating learning for students. And if we use that same color coding and underlining to really get a sense of the gist of what's expected in Standard 4, you see that for the first 4 elements of Standard 4, it's important for teachers to know the ways that learning takes place and know the levels of the students in their classroom. It's important for them to plan instruction that's appropriate for their kids and to use a variety of instructional methods and to integrate and use technology within their instruction. So really thinking about those instructional strategies that are going to be helpful for kids. And then Standard 4 goes on to say that part of facilitating instruction is about helping students. And you'll see helping students shows up in each of these next 2 elements, helping students develop critical thinking and problem solving skills, and helping students work in teams to develop leadership qualities. Teachers who are facilitating instruction have to communicate effectively, and facilitating instruction is important, but unless the teacher is using methods to assess what the students have learned to see whether that instruction is making a difference for kids, then they won't even know if they're moving those students forward. And then finally, in Standard 5, the reflection standard. The reflection standard, Standard 5, expects teachers to analyze the learning of the students in their classroom, to link their own professional growth to their professional goals, and then really to work collaboratively and function effectively in a complex, dynamic environment where all of the teachers in the building are working together collaboratively to meet the needs of the students within their individual classrooms as well as the school as a whole. So again, remembering that the process components are important to address both evaluating, that summative purpose of providing rating at the end of the year, but also supervision, that intentional interaction with knowledgeable others for that formative purpose of improving practice. You might think of supervision as coaching. Who's coaching the teacher to help them be better? It might be the other people on their PLC. It might be a formal mentor. It might be the principal or the assistant principal who's helping give recommendations and advising for classroom improvements from observations. But supervision is the process of coaching. As we think about what it is that teachers are involved with throughout the year, we know that our rubric gets used in a variety of ways and for a variety of things. We have a multi-purpose rubric. It gets used for supervision and for evaluation. Now, remembering that supervision is about that formative process of improving practice. The self-assessment is intended to support the teacher in assessing where they are at the beginning of the year with an eye and a lens towards improvement. The classroom visits and the observations are intended to build over time as the observer goes in and collects information and provides feedback and makes recommendations and partners with the teacher about what to do to reflect on and improve that practice. So the observation rubric as both a formative tool as well as a data container to collect information and move it forward to the end of the year is supervisory or formative in nature, so that all of those things carry information forward. So at the end of the year, the summary rating form can be completed by using all of the data that was collected throughout the year on the observation rubric. So now, as we think about that idea of supervision or support versus evaluating or the rating of those standards overall, let's imagine and pretend that there was a standard called providing appetizing desserts. And if we thought about that standard for providing appetizing desserts, we might have a rubric that identifies specific things in each of those 4 column categories. And in the first column, you might have things like understanding how to read a recipe and recognizing essential baking tools. In the second column, you might have things like make a chocolate cake, decorate the cake with white frosting and sprinkles. In the third column, you might have something like feed the students homemade cake that looks good and tastes great. And then finally, in the last column, you might be expected to assist your colleagues to ensure that there's equitable distribution of cake at the school. So this is the very same rubric that gets used for supervision and evaluation, but the questions are different. Throughout the year, when supervision is taking place, the support and the reflection for improving practice, the questions are, can you bake a cake and can you decorate a cake? So do you understand how to read a recipe? If the answer is no, then you and your evaluator would work together to try to resolve and improve your skill in that area. Are you able to feed students homemade cake that looks great? Looks good and tastes great. If the answer is no, then part of that formative process throughout the year is for you to work with your evaluator and identify ways to help you develop the skills necessary to be able to do that thing that is a part of that third column in the rubric. So as we think about that, providing that supervisory feedback is really important. At the end of the year, your evaluator is going to take all of the information that they have that they collected throughout the year, and they're going to ask some progressive questions as they move from left to right. They're going to ask the question and say, how well did you bake the cake? And how well did you decorate the cake? Did they get evidence that you understand how to read a recipe and recognize essential baking tools? If they know at the end of the year that all of the data says you can do those 2 things, they know that you are at least developing. Then they move to the next one and they ask the question, in addition to that, can you also, or did you also provide evidence that you made that chocolate cake and decorated it with white frosting and sprinkles? If the answer is yes, then you are at least proficient. And then they move and ask the next set of questions. Can they also find evidence that you fed students homemade cake that looks and tastes great? If the answer is yes, then you are at least accomplished in providing appetizing desserts. And then finally, if all of the preceding things are true and you move forward and ask that final question, did you assist your colleagues to ensure the equitable distribution of cake at the school? Then you are at least distinguished. There is this progressive movement and connection of the expectations. This is what's called a conjunctive rubric, as the evaluation process asks the questions at the end of the year. Did you do everything in the first column at least once, everything in the second column at least once, everything in the third column at least once, everything in the fourth column at least once? And based on the answers to those questions, then your evaluator arrives at your final rating overall. So if we think about those imaginary expectations for making appetizing desserts, then we might think of the self-assessment as the place where the teacher asks themselves, what are you already good at and where do you need to learn more? The formative assessment, or the classroom visits, the observations, are an opportunity for the evaluator, the supervisor, the person who is observing the classroom, to say, here's what I noticed on my visit. Tell me more about what you feel really proud of. The data container is when the rubric collects and carries information forward. If this was the example of making the cake, then the data container might carry information about how many cakes you baked throughout the year and how many students you fed. And then finally, at the end of the year, when you're trying to reach that summary rating or the final ratings on each of the elements and the standards, what does the evidence say about how successful you were with each of those expectations? And based on what that evidence says, what should the rating be for this element or for the standard overall? That same process looks something like this. If you think of the year as made up of successive data collection events with formative feedback that are the observations, each of those orange boxes moving up that arrow on the left-hand side of the screen. Then at the end of the year, you would have a consolidated view of the rubric that showed you how many times each item was checked, and you would have a list of some numbers, and each checkbox would have a number in it. And you would make the decision about the final rating by saying, did I see everything in the first column at least once? And if the answer is yes, then they're at least developing in that element. Then you move to the next column and ask the same question again. Did I see everything in that second column at least once? If the answer is yes, they're at least proficient. You move to the next column and ask the question again. Did I see everything in this next column at least once? If the answer is yes, they're at least accomplished. You move to the last column and say, did I also see everything in this column at least once? If the answer is no, you rock back to the previous column where everything in that column and all that preceded it were seen at least once, and that is the overall rating for the element. So understanding the relationship of the rubrics that collect the data over time and how that data is consolidated, brought together, and assessed at the end to establish a final rating for each of the elements and then the standards overall. It's really important to recognize we're using the same tool, the rubric, in two different ways, informative ways, as well as a summative way at the end of the year. The supervision is what's taking place throughout the year during those classroom visits, and the evaluation is the decision-making and the rating that occurs at the very, very end. So as we think about standards and the standards that we use to support teachers and to evaluate teachers, it's important that those standards are aligned. And what does it mean for standards to be aligned? Well, Phi Delta Kappa is an international education organization, and they identify that alignment has three specific components: content, context, and cognitive type. And it is important with any standards that the content, the context, and the cognitive type be aligned. And content is the first one we'll talk about. And content is basically talking about what are the topical expectations. So if we think about our rubric, this is an example from element 2D and 2E. The content of the rubric, the thing we're looking for to see if the teacher knows and is able to do, is the paragraphs within the individual elements themselves. So the content of our rubric for the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards are the paragraphs for each of the elements. Now I want to talk a little bit about the content for standard 3D. We're going to use this as an example. This is 3D, and you'll note that there is a lot of information in that gray area. Let's take just the information in the gray area and let's look at it on the screen. Now, when you look at the expectations of element 3D, what you see here is the expectation of element 3D is that teachers make instruction relevant to students. The element goes on to say teachers incorporate 21st century life skills into their teaching deliberately, strategically, and broadly. These skills include leadership, ethics, accountability, adaptability, personal productivity, personal responsibility, people skills, self-direction, and social responsibilities. Teachers help their students understand the relationship between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and 21st century content, which includes global awareness, financial, economic, business, and entrepreneurial literacy, civic literacy, and health awareness. There's a lot of words. Now, remember a little while ago, we talked about that the original framers of this evaluation system and this rubric wanted this process to be aspirational. I think it's interesting and a little bit ironic that there also is a definition for the term aspirate, which means the act of inhaling fluid or to choke our aspirational standards, unfortunately, are so full of words at first glance that it can make it challenging for a reader, whether that's the evaluator or the teacher themselves, to really understand what the expectations of these elements actually are. And unfortunately, my colleagues and I, in our early support of this rubric, at the trainings that we provided, did not do the best job of equipping teachers in really reading and tuning into the expectations of the elements. We've given the impression across the state that every word in every element is equally important. Well, anybody that's ever taught a third grader or a second grader how to read knows that helping students read a paragraph and find a main idea is a really important elementary literacy skill. And unfortunately, we haven't done a really good job across the state in supporting educators or even giving them permission to read the elements in the teacher rubric to isolate the main idea. So as we think about that, remembering these were aspirational expectations, we wanted to set a high bar in North Carolina. So for element 3D, we wanted teachers to make instruction relevant to students. And the framers of this element said, well, we want teachers to incorporate 21st century life skills into their teaching. And someone said, let's let them know we're really serious about it. Let's say we want them to do it deliberately, strategically, and broadly. And then someone in the room said, okay, 21st century life skills, those are important, but you know, didn't we all agree those are all kind of new? What if people don't know what we're talking about? They said, okay, well, let's just put the list right here in the element. These skills include leadership, ethics, accountability, adaptability, personal productivity, personal responsibility, people skills, self-direction, and social responsibility. And then after that list, they went on to add the phrase, teachers help their students understand the relationship between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and 21st century content. And then somebody said, what is 21st century content? Oh, they need another list. This includes global awareness, financial, economic, business, and entrepreneurial literacy, civic literacy, and health awareness. So as we think about the structure of element 3D, there is a lot of language here. But each of the phrases within element 3D provides a slightly different purpose. And as we think about element 3D and really try to tune into what the expectation of element 3D is, what we discover is that, and actually environmental literacy is in our current version of the standards if you look at the rubric online. But if you happen to have an old 2008, 2009 paper handbook, environmental literacy actually was not even in this element at that time. It was added later. So even the expectation of this element evolved and changed over time. But as we think about what it requires for teachers to make instruction relevant to students, the most important line in this element, the one that really gets to the business of the expectation, is that teachers need to help their students understand the relationship between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and 21st century content. I'm going to come back to this in a few slides and show you how I can be confident that that actually is the most important phrase or the most critical piece of information in this element. So I'll be coming back to help you see how we can kind of check and ensure that we know that this is the right phrase. Every element has a main idea if you take the time to try to locate it. So going back to Phi Delta Kappa, content is what are the topical expectations? And as we read the elements in North Carolina's professional teaching standards, really understanding how to read the whole paragraph and get at the most key main ideas is an important thing. And it's important for teachers and principals to know that they're allowed to read them and try to find the most important phrase or the most important line. Let's talk now, though, a little bit about context. Context really is just a fancy way of saying, where do those topical expectations take place? So what we're asking with context is, where should the observer look to see if those things are happening? And we know that content is the paragraphs themselves. If you look at the rubric that's on the screen, in the paper-based version of the rubric, the context is indicated way over on the left-hand side in that column, where in the top row, you see two little check marks. but in the bottom row, there are no check marks. That is the context marker. That little check, if there is a little check, it tells you you need to look specifically while instruction is taking place. And if there is no check, it means you need to look someplace else. Now, in the past, a lot of folks, myself and my colleagues at DPI included, referred to those items where there was a check mark on the left as observables. The problem with using the term observable to describe those rows is it suggests that the row with no check mark is not observable. However, if you think about how a principal would know if a teacher is responding to family and community concerns, communicating and collaborating with the home and community, recognizing obstacles of family and community participation, and promoting trust and understanding throughout the school or community, the way you would know those things were happening would be if you observed them. However, you would not be observing them while you're watching the teacher teach in the classroom. That's why that column where the check marks are or are not is labeled at the top observation. You would see these things while watching teaching. So as we think about that, it's really all about the context. It's all about what you see and when you see it, because all of it is observable. So if the calendar you see on the screen represented two observations, one that occurred on the 6th of January and one that occurred on the 14th of March, and we were talking about the rubric that was going to get filled out on the 14th of March, you would look for those top two rows in element 2D, the ones that have observation check marks in that first column. You would look for those in the classroom on the 14th of March. However, for the row here that says response to family and community concerns, element 2E, you're not going to be looking for that while you're watching teaching. In fact, if you see a teacher responding to community and family concerns while a lesson is supposed to be taking place, something has actually gone terribly awry. So the question is, well, when should I look for those? How will I know that they're taking place? Well, let's say there was an open house on Wednesday, the 17th of January. And during that open house, you noticed that for this teacher, they got 100% participation. Every parent showed up. Every parent showed up for the open house, and even the parents who were divorced and raising their kids separately with shared custody, mom and dad showed up. They didn't sit near each other in the classroom, but they were there. That meeting on the 17th of February provides you information to allow you to check the checkbox for responding to family and community concerns, but you don't check the checkbox. You're not filling the rubric out until the actual observation itself. So those items that are observation items that you see while watching teaching, you would see those while you're looking at the teaching itself. But those items that don't have that check mark in the observation row, you've got to think about when you see those things. Now, I talked a little while ago about the difference in instructional practices and professional practices. This is one of the ways to know the difference in instructional practices and professional practices. Instructional practices are visible while watching the teacher engage with students in a lesson. Professional practices are visible while the teacher is involved with other parts of the work that they do. So that's context. Should I see it while watching the teacher teach? Or is there some other place and some other time that I need to gather that information to know whether or not I can check the box when I fill out the next rubric for the next classroom observation? Cognitive type is what is the expected level of performance. So the cognitive type is related to the expectations of the teacher's level of performance. So that is simply the movement of the rubric and the change in expectations as we move from the left side of the rubric, that developing column, all the way over to the right side of the rubric, that distinguished column. Now, we can't talk about cognitive type and that progression of expectations without acknowledging and talking about the revised Bloom's taxonomy. The revised Bloom's taxonomy came about when students of Bloom got together and were talking about the Bloom's taxonomy. Now, if you're a teacher an educator over a certain age in this meeting, we started our career talking about the Bloom's taxonomy, not the revised Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy had words on it that ended in ing, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. But what happened was Bloom had some students that went out for drinks after class one day, and they said, hey, this was a really interesting class. We get the idea of remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, but remembering what? Understanding what? Applying what? It seems to us that the whats are really equally important. And so what his students actually discovered that those cognitive processes that Bloom came up with so many years before were only a part of the story. The other part of the story was the knowledge dimension. And the revised Bloom's taxonomy and seeing it as this two-dimensional table helps educators to recognize the relationship of the process dimension and the knowledge dimension, because it's hard to articulate expectations without two words. And so in the case of Bloom's taxonomy, the most common things that show up in student standards are requirements to remember facts, to understand concepts, to apply procedures, and to analyze metacognition, or to ask students to think about their own thinking. So as we think about really drilling in or tuning into cognitive expectations as being important to find the intersection of the cognitive process dimension and the knowledge dimension, we have to have two words to find that intersection. We've got to have two words, an action and a subject or an object. So remember facts, understand concepts, apply procedures, analyze metacognition. Those all have the two words that allow us to position it on this two-dimensional grid. So as we're thinking about how we want to measure the expectations of the standards that are outlined in the rubric, one of the important first steps is to isolate that specific expectation. So this is the phrase we looked at a few slides back when we broke down element 3D and we pulled out and acknowledged the component parts, where almost half of the words in element 3D are to give you lists of skills and expectations. But there's a phrase right here near the end that says teachers help their students understand the relationship between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and 21st century content. Now, in this next slide, I'm going to share with you a little bit about how I know that's the right most important phrase. And the reason I know that's the right most important phrase is if I look down at the descriptors themselves. The descriptors in the rubric are are directly connected to that phrase. As we expect teachers to help their students understand the relationship between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and 21st century content, it is essential to identify relationships between the Standard Course of Study and 21st century content, to identify relationships between the core content and 21st century skills. We can't integrate that core content unless we understand those relationships. And deepening those understandings, that expectation in the last column, can only occur once those understandings are established. So as we think about this, what we discover is, like the Bloom's taxonomy, each of these expectations in each of these element columns is phrased in two words: identifies relationships, integrates content, deepens understandings. Those two words, and finding those two words within each of the descriptors, is really an important thing for teachers and their evaluators to talk about, because this is what helps the evaluator to know whether or not they could or should mark those particular columns. Now, this example is pretty simple because there are just two words in each of those columns. There are places within the rubric where you get what I call a buy one, get one free. And in those spots, you have things that are conjoined by the word and. Sorry about that, I coughed again. So in this example, adapts instruction for the benefit of students with special needs and helps colleagues to do the same for their students. What we would have here are a pair of two words: adapts instruction and helps colleagues. So So if we thought about capturing those words on individual little sticky notes, kind of like you see here on the screen, as I shared with you previously, and then let's imagine that we looked at other places in the rubric and we had these sticky notes. And we organized them for multiple rows of the rubric itself, so that we took all of the yellow sticky notes from the first column of several elements, all of the green sticky notes from the first column, from the second column of several elements, and we stacked those all together and made a big chart up on the wall. We would end up with some collections of verbs and nouns that looks a little bit like what you see on the screen. What I'd like to do right now is take about 4 minutes just looking at what's on the screen. I want you to get yourself oriented to what you see on the screen. And I want you to think about what you notice about the relationship of the words in each of the rows of the yellow column. How do the items in the yellow column relate to each other? And then move over and ask yourself that same question about the green column. How do the items in the green column relate to each other? And then move over to the blue column and ask yourself that same question. And then finally move over to that tan column and ask that same question. I'm going to take a few minutes, about 4 minutes. I'm going to put my mic on mute, so you just have a minute just to kind of look and make those connections. And then I want to talk a little bit more about what it is that makes the yellow similar to one another and the green similar to one another, and how that might be helpful to us as we think about what teachers are doing and how principals and observers can support them in their work. So let's take about 4 minutes just to quickly review that, and then we'll come back to it in just a moment. I know you're still taking a moment to make some comparisons of these words, but several of you probably are all the way over to the blue column and maybe even the tan column right now. What I want to invite you to do over the next minute or two is see if you can find the chat bar, and let's think about that yellow column. As you look at that yellow column, what do you notice that the items in the yellow column have in common with one another? How are the items in the yellow column related? Do you see a relationship? And if you think you have some ideas, drop those in the chat bar so that others can see what you're thinking. Talk just about the yellow column first.
Hey, Robert, this is Cammie. Did you want me to read out some of the answers for you, or can you see them?
I have figured out how to get that little box to show up. So thank
Awesome.
you for asking.
Okay, you're welcome.
So I can see that we've got some self-starters who dove right out there and dropped some ideas in. That's really good. So somebody identified or acknowledged that what they noticed there is that the language is about showing awareness and connecting to and understanding needs. So understanding needs, showing awareness, knowledge, those are some of the ideas that have shown up in the chat bar so far. So what I'd like to think about now is let's shift gears and let's move over to the green column. Looking at that green column, what do you notice about those things that are in the green column? So drop in the chat bar what you notice about those things in the green column. If, as you think about the green column, you notice how the green column is different from the yellow column, and that's what you want to drop in the chat bar, that's okay too. Couple of words that showed up in the chat bar really, really quick were the idea of engagement, application, action. Those were the things that you recognized pretty quickly. And then thinking about that relationship of the yellow and green, yellow is about basic understanding and green is about implementing or going forward and not just having the knowledge, but also using the knowledge. So that's excellent. You're already beginning to see that progression and that movement as we move from left to right in the rubric. There is a progression and there is a movement as we move from left to right in the rubric. And I wanted you to see it on the screen like this as we talk about it. And the way to see it is to pull out those actions, the verbs and the nouns, to unpack it using the revised Bloom's taxonomy as a model. Recognizing this is helpful to supporting educators, because one of the opportunities that the evaluator has is to help an educator think about their own practice as it connects to the rubric itself. And so helping the educator think about that sometimes involves reflecting on and asking individual questions. So remember, we talked a little bit before about the instructional practice standards and the professional practice standards. This standard, that's the element that's on the screen now, is element 4E. It's an instructional practice standard. I know it's an instructional practice standard because I see that little check way over on the left-hand side, which means this row is items that can be seen during observation. If they are instructional practice standards, there are a set of reflective questions that a teacher can ask that will align to all of the instructional practice standards. And the reflective question for the first column is, do you know it? So all of those things in the yellow column in the previous slide are about the teacher's knowledge. A reflective question for the second column in these instructional practice standards is, do you show it? Are you doing it? Are you taking the knowledge from the first column and putting it into action or practice in the second column? A reflective question for the third column, in this example for element 4E, it says, teaches students the processes needed to. How would you know if a teacher was teaching those processes? Well, you wouldn't know unless you look to see if the students had acquired those processes. So the third reflective question is it visible in the actions of your students? Now, you might be thinking, well, what is the it? Well, do you know it? Do you understand what it is you're supposed to be doing? Are you doing that thing that you're supposed to be doing? When you do it, does it show up in the actions and the outcomes of the kids? And then finally, in that last column, this last column expectation for this element says encourages and assists teachers throughout the school to integrate these critical thinking skills. The reflective question for teachers here is it visible beyond the instructional space of your classroom? So movement from left to right in the rubric for the instructional practice standards is asking the teacher, do you understand what you're supposed to do? First column. Are you able to do those things? Second column. When you do those things, do good things happen for your kids? Third column. And then the last column is asking, is your work as an educator making this school the best it can possibly be? So these reflective questions will hold up pretty solid in the instructional practice standards. But there's those professional practice standards, you know, the one about supporting communities and families that we saw in a previous slide. Well, it's reasonable then to say, well, is there a corresponding relationship? And the answer is actually yes, across the whole rubric, whether they are instructional or professional practice standards. The first column measures knowledge. The second column measures action. The third column measures interaction. And the fourth column measures extension. Now, without getting into a great deal of discussion or conversation at this particular slide, many of you may have noticed at the beginning of the year when you pulled up the rubric and started looking at the, the columns of the rubric that you will find at the top of the rubric, positioned next to the words developing, proficient, accomplished, and distinguished, their corresponding words, knowledge, action, interaction, and extension. And that's because we are hopeful that during post-conference conversations after a classroom observation, that evaluators and teachers will not use the words developing, proficient, accomplished, or distinguished to talk about an individual observation. Because the evaluation words developing, proficient, accomplished, or distinguished really should only be used when there is a collection of data, more than one observation, available to talk about. What you're talking about with a single classroom observation is whether or not you saw evidence of knowledge, action, interaction, or extension. You're having discussions about what you saw while watching teaching as it is articulated in the descriptors of the rubric. So why does this matter? Well, one of the reasons that it matters is because teachers want to make sure that they are bringing forward the best examples of their work. They're teaching the hardest they can possibly teach every day that they're with kids, and they're hopeful that the day that principals show up to observe, that they're able to see those things that are happening. But teachers also recognize there's a whole dimension of their work that may not be completely visible during the 20 minutes or 45 minutes that someone's actually sitting and watching the classroom. So it's important for teachers to know and have confidence that the evidences and the artifacts and the things they want to collect, to bring forward, to share, to talk about are really going to help their observer get the right places in the rubric marked. So as we think about how a teacher can promote his or her practice best, when we ask the teacher, do you know it? How can you share with your evaluator or your observer that you know it? One way that a teacher can do that is by sharing a lesson plan. But it's also important for a teacher to know that a lesson plan all by itself is never going to be helpful to an evaluator to mark anything in the rubric other than things in that very first column. Because when you move to that question, do you show it, to look for things in the second column, the lesson plan itself isn't very helpful because the lesson plan isn't teaching the lessons, the actions of the teacher that are actually doing that work. And then remember that question, is it visible in the actions of your students? Well, a really helpful artifact for whether or not something is visible in the actions of the students is student work samples. Student work samples provide real, authentic evidence of student understanding of concepts from the curriculum. Very often, teachers will think that for artifacts and evidences that they want to share with their evaluator, that they need to be things that the teacher produced. But actually, things that the teacher produced aren't going to move them much further to the right in the rubric than the proficient column. Because as we're asking that question, is your knowledge and action visible in the actions of your students? And then finally, is it visible beyond the instructional space of your classroom? The observer has to have a lens into what's happening for the kids, as well as what's happening for the other colleagues that that teacher is interacting with, working with, and supporting. So helping the teacher and making sure that teachers understand that progression of the rubric, it's much more valuable than those evaluation labels that really only get used at the end to rate the teaching as developing, proficient, accomplished, or distinguished. It's more helpful to say to a teacher after the very first observation, I was able to check lots of boxes that indicate that you have the knowledge that you need. I was able to check many of the boxes that show that you're taking appropriate action. I had a harder time checking boxes for me to see the interaction, what's happening as a result of your teaching. So as we think about the next observation, let's talk about what I might want to look for and what you may want to do differently to help elevate those things and make them visible for me. And then finally, having a conversation with a teacher about how the observer can see that teacher's extension of practice. If you are a principal who finds it impossible because there are so many other demands on your time to get around the building and walk in and peek in the windows and listen to the discussions of your PLCs, you're going to have a really hard time ever getting a lens into that extension of practice, because that last column of the rubric really is asking how the teacher is engaging and interacting with their colleagues to make the building, the school, the best that it can possibly be. So if you're not able to see that, you're not going to be able to mark those things in the rubric. In that case, the teacher's going to have to think about what he or she can bring forward to help you. Are there minutes of meetings? Are there ways that can help you understand what the problems were that that team was trying to solve, or the discussions that they were having, so that the teacher can get full credit for the things they're doing in that extreme right-hand side of the rubric? Now, coming back to those two important terms, the evaluation part, the part that happens at the end when the ratings get assigned to each of those elements and standards, to the supervision part, the support of the teaching, that formative process that happens throughout the year. Let's talk a little bit about that supervision part. How can the evaluator help to use the rubric and communicate with the teacher in a way that helps them to grow and improve as related to the expectations of the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards? What we know is that supervision, that formative process, is the aspect of the educator evaluation process that's really all about growth and improvement. So how are we helping teachers to improve their practice and identify ways that they can make the teaching that they're doing the best that it can possibly be? Because we know that when you're green, you grow, and when you're ripe, you rot. So the question is, how can we help teachers remain ripe and growing? It's really important to help teachers think about what they're doing, acknowledge the things that they're really good at, but then also identify ways that they can continuously improve their practice. Teaching is not static. A teacher could have been teaching for 30 or 40 years, but every year presents new and unique shifts, changes, and challenges. There's a new batch of students at the beginning of every year. We're on a cycle where textbooks and instructional resources change, on a cycle so that every 3, 4, or 5 years there are changes and shifts in curriculum and standards and resources. So teaching is not a static endeavor. And so using the rubric as the constant to anchor those conversations is really helpful, and can especially be helpful for those formative discussions. And this cartoon on the screen is an example of why those labels, developing, proficient, accomplished, and distinguished, are not particularly helpful to those post-conference conversations. So let's unpack this. Let's unpack this image that we see here on the screen. So we have this little dog talking to his owner, and he says, I'm going to need a little more formative feedback, a little more specific feedback on my formative assessment. And so this dog has gotten a formative assessment that says, you are a bad dog. Now, think about the purpose of formative assessments. Formative assessments are to inform, to help support the improvement of practice. So it may be absolutely true that this dog is a bad dog, but there are a variety of ways that this dog could be a bad dog. This might be a bad dog because he bites the mailman. He might be a bad dog because he chases the cat. He might be a bad dog because he soils your fancy oriental rug. He might be a bad dog because he chews up the sofa cushions. But if the only feedback that he got is that he's a bad dog, he lacks strategies to know what to do to be a better dog. So the formative support is intended to help provide the teacher feedback and information to help them improve their practice. As we have been doing work with educators throughout the state since 2011, we had opportunities to talk to principals and ask them about their post-conference conversations. And what we discovered when we talked to principals about their post-conference conversations is that even though they use slightly different words to talk about those discussions and to talk about those conversations, all of those ways that they shared how they discussed the instruction and the observation with those teachers had three things in common. Every principal throughout the years that we talked to them talked about three distinct ways that they talked with teachers during post-conference conversations. And our team took all of those and kind of boiled them down together and discovered what principals were telling us is that during post-conference conversations, to try to help teachers think about their practice and improve their practice, they shared information and asked questions in ways that did three different things. They would promote, probe, and push. And promote simply means to identify behaviors or practices that were successful. And actually, every teacher learns this concept of promoting when they have their very, very first conference with a parent of a difficult child. Most teachers, when they have that very first conference with a parent of a difficult child, they are really, really nervous about that conference. It's going to happen at the end of the year, and they're a nervous wreck in the teacher's lounge and at lunch, and they're talking about it. They don't know what they're going to say when they have that conference with that parent to talk about all the difficulties, and all of their colleagues who are offering sage advice, who've been at this teaching thing for a lot longer, they say to them, just start with something positive. Start your conversation with something positive. And that's what promote means for a post-conference conversation. Start the conversation with something positive. And it's really easy to talk about something positive by using the rubric. If you observed a lesson and you saw lots and lots of examples of things that were in that first column, you might start the post-conference by saying, it was clear to me when I observed your classroom today that you really know and understand those critical thinking skills that you're supposed to be teaching those students. I recognize it in the language that you used. I recognize it in the ways that you answered students' questions. You are promoting and acknowledging something positive that the teacher is doing, and you're connecting it directly to the rubric and the items that are in that very first column. The second thing that you can do to support a teacher is probe. Probing is asking a question to better understand or to confirm your understanding. Even though there are many things in this rubric that you can see while watching teaching, that's the purpose of the observation and collecting that information on the rubric. Sometimes just because you see something doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening, and I'll give you an example. If you were watching a third grade lesson where the kids were organized in table groups and you had 4 different tables, and on each table you noticed that each table group was talking about a different reading passage or a different reading selection. One group had a reading selection all about volcanoes, and another group had a reading selection all about alligators, and another group had a reading selection all about mammals, and a different group had a reading selection all about reptiles. You might assume that what you're watching is a differentiated reading lesson with 4 different groups, and each group having its own specific reading materials. But you wouldn't know for sure unless you ask the teacher. So a probe question in an example like that might be to say to the teacher, so I was in your classroom today when I was observing, and I noticed that you had 4 different groups. Everybody seemed to be really well engaged. I noticed the students recognized the student responsibilities cards. Everybody seemed to be doing what they were supposed to do. But tell me a little bit about what was going on with each of those tables, because I noticed there was a different reading selection at each of the tables. Well, the teacher might say to you, well, as a matter of fact, that reading selection was based on how they did on their last literacy assessment, and so they were grouped specifically like that. and I organized them in those topics based on how they did on the last reading assessment. Then you would know that that was an example of a differentiated assignment. The kids were grouped based on their outcomes of the last reading assessment, so you could check the box on the rubric that talks about differentiating instruction. But it's also possible the teacher might say to you, well, I knew that there was a variety of interests in this classroom, and it's really important for students to read based on their interest level. So I put out those 3 different topics, and students self-selected which table they would choose to sit at. Now, that self-selecting reading, that is not a bad strategy. That's actually excellent. Students should have opportunities to self-select some of the texts that they read. But you wouldn't want to check a box that said that that was a differentiated lesson if the reason that the kids were sitting at those separate tables was simply that they had self-selected a different topic or a different different subject for the reading material. But you would only know that for sure if you ask that probing question. If it was not obvious during the lesson that that was a differentiated lesson, you would have to ask a probing question in order to uncover that, to know if you should check that box for differentiating or not. And then finally, a push question. If you think about the rubric and moving from left to right, you would promote on the left-hand side. It's really easy, even if a teacher doesn't have very many checks on the right-hand side of the rubric. If you know the teacher knows the stuff they're supposed to know, they understand those things in that knowledge column, you can acknowledge that by promoting it and patting them on the back for the things that they know. You want to probe in those places in the rubric where you've got some check boxes you're thinking about checking, but you're not really sure if you should check them or not. And then finally, the push questions are ways to look at the rubric, think about spots where you haven't checked any boxes over on the right. What's a question you could ask or something you could say to get the teacher to consider what they might do to allow you to check that box the next time? Now, a really easy probe question or push question, the lowest hanging fruit of the push questions, because of the way many of the descriptors in the distinguished column are articulated, is to say to a teacher, you're going to promote, I see that you know the things that you need to know in order to provide this support for your kids. I see that you provided this lesson on critical thinking and problem solving. I'm curious, this is a probe question, about how you decided which particular critical thinking and problem solving skills you wanted to use today. I'm interested in knowing what your plan is after your experiences today and seeing what the students learned. And I'm especially curious, here's your push question, how you're going to support your colleagues on your grade level to help them to integrate some of these critical thinking and problem solving tasks that you've been so successful with in this lesson so that they can utilize them as well. So that would be a push question. The easiest push question is to ask a teacher how they're going to help other teachers in their school to do the helpful things that they are doing. We have a comment in the chat bar that says maintaining a portfolio of artifacts and evidences to share with the evaluator is very helpful. It's extremely helpful. And understanding the rubric and recognizing kind of what categories they go in. Is this an artifact of my knowledge? Is this an artifact of my action? Is it an artifact of my interaction? Or is it an artifact of my extension of influence to the larger, broader school beyond my individual classroom? So it's one thing to have a collection of artifacts in a big old box, in a big old pile. It's even more beneficial to have that box organized or sorted or arranged so that those things that support knowledge are together, those things that support action, those things that support interaction, and those things that support extension can be with one another. And what your teachers will discover over time is they don't want to load that box with evidence of knowledge. They want the box to have more evidences of action, interaction, and extension, because that's what it's going to take to get to the right-hand side of the rubric. So as we think about that, I just want to loop back around as we're closing in on our time today, and let's talk a little bit about that observation context. We know that those instructional practices are those things that are acknowledged on the rubric as observation items. In the old paper rubric, there was a little check mark, as you see here on the screen over on the left. In the online rubric, the one you encounter in the online tool, you won't see this left-hand column with check marks in it, but what you will see is at the top of each column, for each of those things that are an observation row, you will see the word observation typed in the rubric online. So these check marks on the paper rubric have been translated in the online tool into the word observation at the top of the column. So I want to talk a little bit about this, instructional practices versus professional practices. The instructional practices you see while watching teaching, and the professional practices you have to see someplace else. Maybe you see those at the open house, or maybe you're aware of the teacher's professional practices because you see how they are interacting with their peers, or maybe you are in the office when the teacher comes up to use the phone to call the parents, to talk to the parents, or maybe you require your teachers to have parent newsletters and you check them from time to time and you review them to see what they're sharing. Or maybe you hear about the great things teachers are doing from parents who are really excited about what the teacher is sharing with them. So thinking about where you can get that information for those things that you can't see while watching teaching is really important. It's also really important to think about when and where to look. Even those things that are instructional practice standards, when you think about the rubric and the knowledge, action, interaction, and extension, even in those instructional practice standards, there are actually items in the rubric that you don't have to be sitting in the classroom to see necessarily. If you think about the rubric for an instructional practice element, and those are the elements in standards 2, 3, and 4, and the bottom row of 1A is an instructional practice standard. That first column, that developing column, is looking for evidence of the teacher's knowledge of appropriate content, practices, or pedagogy. Now, you can see that while you're watching teaching because the things the teachers do can be evidence of that, but you also could learn that by having a conversation with the teacher. You could also learn that by reading communications that the teacher is providing to students and families. You could learn that if you overhear a discussion that the teacher is having with their colleagues, or you're listening into a PLC conversation. Or you could have a direct discussion with the educator themselves. So it's quite possible, even though for an observation or an instructional practice standard or element, it's quite possible you could know those things that are measured in that developing column before you ever even walk into the classroom. However, the proficient and the accomplished column, the evidence of action and the evidence of interaction, can only be seen while you're watching teaching. So the kinds of things that would help you know whether you could check those boxes for those instructional practice standards are the instructional interactions that the teacher is engaged with around a specific lesson, activity, or assignment, from which the observer can reasonably assess each of the following: the teacher's input, the student's interaction and engagement, and the instructional outcomes. It became important a year ago to really begin to think about this and when, where, and how to see these proficient and accomplished behaviors, because there were times, and there may be times in the future when you have to think about how you're going to collect information about the teacher's instructional practices from online or remote instructional experiences. So understanding the rubric and the relationship of these actions and interactions and where to look becomes especially important if you find yourself in a place that you've got to assess the teacher's actions in remote instructional experiences. Now, we said that those observation rows are things that you see while watching teaching. There's one little piece of that that actually is a big fat lie. And that's that last column, the distinguished column, even for an observation row, even for an instructional practice standard. The distinguished column are things you actually will not see while watching teaching. The distinguished column is evidence of that teacher's extension of influence. How are they making the students better outside of the classroom? So you may find things in that distinguished column that talk about students using critical thinking and problem-solving skills outside of the classroom or in the real world. More frequently, what you'll find is descriptors that talk about the teacher extending their influence by helping their colleagues, helping the other teachers in the building do particular things. So even in instructional practice standards, those things that are observation elements, That extreme right-hand column, the distinguished column, the extension of practice won't be visible while watching a single lesson. It takes information that the principal or observer is aware of outside of the that individual lesson all by itself. As we think about those professional practice standards, the ones that for many years we referred to as the non-observables, they are observable. You have to see them, but you don't see them while you're watching the teacher teach in a classroom with kids. The place where you can see those professional practice standards, the items in Standard 1 about leadership and items in Standard 5 about the teacher's reflection, you're going to see examples of those as you watch the teacher's interactions with others during their school level committee activities, when they're engaged in subject or grade level teams, in their professional learning communities, when they're working through identifying expectations for lessons, looking at student work, figuring out whether or not students met those outcomes, working together to design instruction or common formative assessments. When you watch teachers engage in your school improvement processes, your school improvement teams, all of those are environments that give the observer the opportunity to see the kinds of things that are measured in the professional practice elements of the rubric. There are specific items in element 2E, is the one we've talked about in previous slides about engaging and interacting with families. So one of the questions for an administrator to think about is when and in what ways do I have the ability to see a teacher's interactions with the families and the communities that their students come from? If you don't know the answer to that question, then you won't have the information that you need to be able to check the boxes in that particular row of the rubric. So you need to begin to think about how you could have a lens into that. You may need to ask the teacher to help you have some of that information. They may need to provide for you some examples of interactions with parents via some communications. Or it could be as simple as the teacher says to you, well, let me share with you the place where I have a Q&A board where my parents post questions and I provide answers. And then all you have to do then is log on and go to see it. Once you know that it's there, then you can go look for it and go see it. A few of the other things that can help give you a lens into whether or not the teacher is addressing some of those professional practice standards are how the school and the community engages, how that teacher interacts with their colleagues, as well as their conversations with other educators. So the professional practice standards are visible. You have to observe them, but they're visible outside of instructional activities. And you can actually see those professional practice standards in between observations, just like the example that I gave earlier. If you have an open house that precedes the next time you do a classroom visit, your knowledge of those professional practices that you saw during the open house can be captured on the observation rubric at the next classroom visit because you know that they occurred and they preceded the completion of that rubric. So this is beginning to draw us to a close for the topics that I wanted to talk about today. I just want to remind you that Cammie and I are always interested in trying to be supportive and helpful to you. This slide has our email addresses on it, so I would encourage you to jot those down. Based on the familiar names that I do see in the participant list today, many of you already probably have our names in your inboxes because we've communicated in the past. But I want to thank you for your time today. I'm going to stay on the line for as long as we like in case there are individual questions that come up. We are going to provide a feedback form, and just a reminder, there are 0.2 CEUs, they're general credits for this work today because we did keep you for an extended period of time for this topic. And again, there'll be a follow-up email that comes out in a day or so to get your feedback so that once we have that feedback, we can provide you with that certificate of completion. And then I'm going to leave this slide up to share with you just a few of the individuals that are provide us support as NCEES contacts to help give Cammie and me a lens and insight into what's happening in the district and provide us information to help provide the best support that we can provide for you. And then finally, if you experience any issues with the NCEES, with the online tool, there is a process by which you can report those to the help desk. We do like to have those as much as possible centralized. So if there's a problem happening in a district, we'd like for the district to report that to the help desk so that we can try to figure out what's going on and get that resolved. So I want to thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm going to remain online for just a few minutes to see if there are any questions or comments or anything that come up. Cammie, I want to see if there's anything you had hoped that I would address that I did not talk about before we kind of formally call our time to a close and let those who would like to move on to other things get started on those things.
Hey, Robert, that was very informative. Thank you. And anybody else, if you'd like to unmute yourself, if you have a question or comment that you didn't want to type in the chat, now's the time to do that. Thank you, Robert.
And I'm happy to hang on for as long as we want to engage in conversation. So if you have a question or a thought, I invite you to share it. If you're interested, please feel free, and I'll remain on the line. But again, for those of you that may have something else you need to get to, I just appreciate the fact that you were able to give us almost 2 hours of your time this afternoon when there probably were 1,000 other things that were competing for your time. So thank you for making time for this afternoon.
Robert, there's a question on, are you going to share the slides? I don't think we had a link to the slides. We can include that in the follow-up email.
Yes, we'll send them in the follow-up. I did not have time today because of other things to get it configured in a way that we could get them the link to it today.
Okay. If it's all right with you, Robert, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but that's not going to end our session. I don't see any other. Well, there's a question that came in. I'll leave it running.
So the question is, there a separate session for how to evaluate school counselors or social workers? So while Cammie and I provide support for the evaluation process and the system overall, there actually are other DPI employees that provide direct support for counselors and other roles like social workers. So the general tenets of the expectations, the structure of the rubric, moving from left to right, all those kinds of things, those are consistent regardless of the job type that the rubric is associated with. But I would encourage you to reach out to those DPI staff that specifically support those counselors in their work and the social workers in their work if you have questions unique to those individual rubrics. I can speak to the broader structure. All of the rubrics for teacher roles that are approved by the State Board of Education have the same 5 overarching standards. So the counselor rubric is organized into leadership, equity, content, instruction, and reflection. The social worker rubric is also leadership, content, leadership, equity, content, instruction, and reflection. But the specific expectations within the individual descriptors are aligned to their areas of focus or their content areas. That was a loose, wordy answer to basically there are other people that are smarter than us that provide that support.
And I'll add, Dr. Simmons also created an awesome Google site for us with resources and information. And if you go out there and click into like the support area and then click on counselors, if you scroll down the page, there are resources and some video webinar links out there as well.
And Cammie, look at this item in the chat bar about the school number. That may be something important that needs to get passed on to somebody else.
Has a new school number. So Adam, did you have a question about that? Did you want to know if you're showing up in NCEES?
Yeah, it's not in the system. That's what I was trying to write down there.
Okay.
I was trying to give the feedback, and I realized that our new school is not in there, and we have a school number.
Oh, it's not in that list. Oh, okay. I thought I grabbed all the new ones. I will go check that and make sure it's in the list. Was there an other option?
There is other school. We have other
Mhm.
MSA.
Go ahead and select that, and then thank you for letting me know, and I'll check on that
Okay,
and make sure it's added in the rest of the webinar list.
okay, thank you.
Tammy, I'm going to say we're good to stop the recording.